My fiancé slept with my mother. Days before our wedding, so I exposed them both. They thought I'd stay quiet to protect the family. Instead, I ruined their perfect secret in front of everyone they knew. My name is Rebecca, and I'm 28 years old. Right now, I'm standing at the altar of St. Mary's Cathedral, wearing the most beautiful wedding dress I've ever seen, surrounded by 200 guests who have no idea what's about to happen. The white silk feels heavy against my skin, and the cathedral's stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across the marble floor. My bouquet of white roses trembles slightly in my hands, but not from nerves about marriage. I'm trembling because in exactly 24 hours, my entire world crumbled into pieces. My father stands beside me, his arm linked with mine, his face stern but supportive. He knows what I know now. He's the only one who does. In the front row, my mother sits perfectly composed in her navy blue dress, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as if she's the picture of a proud mother. Next to me, my fiancé adjusts his tie, nervously flashing that charming smile that once made my heart skip beats. Now it makes my stomach turn. The organ music fills the cathedral as guests whisper among themselves, admiring the decorations my mother insisted on choosing. White lies everywhere exactly as she wanted. The same flowers she mentioned loving in her diary entries about him, about them together. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in English literature from Columbia University. I work as a senior editor at Morrison & Associates Publishing, one of the most prestigious publishing houses in Manhattan. I've built a life I'm proud of, a career that matters, relationships I treasure, or at least I thought I had. My father is Pastor Williams, respected throughout our community for his integrity and wisdom. Ironically, he raised me to value honesty above all else. My fiancé comes from the prominent Blackwell family, old money connections, the kind of background that looks perfect on paper and in wedding announcements. 3 years ago, when he proposed during intermission at Lincoln Center while we watched Swan Lake, I thought I was living a fairy tale. The spotlight hit the stage as he knelt with a 3-carat diamond ring, and everyone in our section turned to watch. It was magical, perfect, everything I dreamed of since I was a little girl. The wedding planning started immediately. My mother threw herself into every detail with an intensity that should have been my first warning. She insisted on choosing the venue, the flowers, the menu, even my dress. When I suggested alternatives, she'd get this look in her eyes, desperate, almost panicked, and say things like, "Sweetheart, trust me, I know what's best." I thought she was just being an overprotective mother living vicariously through my big day. Now I understand she was planning the wedding where she'd watch the man she was sleeping with marry her daughter. The pianist begins the processional, and I take my first step down the aisle. Each footstep echoes in the vast cathedral, and I can feel 200 pairs of eyes on me. Some guests smile and wave subtly. Others wipe away tears, thinking they're witnessing a beautiful love story. They have no idea they're about to witness something entirely different. My bouquet contains a small surprise tucked between the roses. A few pages from my mother's diary. The evidence that shattered my world yesterday afternoon. The pages where she detailed every intimate moment with my fiancé, every lie they told me, every plan they made to continue their affair after today. As I walk toward the altar, I'm not the naive girl who believed in perfect love and happy endings. I'm a woman who discovered that sometimes the people you trust most are capable of the deepest betrayals. And sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to refuse to be a victim of their lies. The wedding march continues, and with each step, I'm walking toward the moment when I'll show everyone exactly who I really am. 3 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I woke up every morning in my cozy apartment on the Upper West Side, walked to work at Morrison & Associates, where I edited manuscripts that would become bestsellers, and came home to plan the wedding of my dreams with the man I thought was my soulmate. My daily routine was predictable and comfortable. Coffee at 7, a quick scan of industry news, then the subway to my office, where I spent hours immersed in stories about other people's lives. I specialized in contemporary fiction, particularly novels about relationships and family dynamics. The irony isn't lost on me now. I was an expert at spotting plot holes and character inconsistencies in fiction, but completely blind to them in my own life. My fiancé worked at Sterling Martinez and Associates, one of Manhattan's top law firms. He specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, pulling in a 6-figure-year salary that allowed us to plan the kind of wedding that gets featured in magazines. We'd been together for 3 years, living separately, but spending most nights together talking about buying a house in Connecticut once we were married. The engagement had been everything I'd ever dreamed of. During Swan Lake's second intermission, he'd excused himself supposedly to get champagne. Instead, the spotlight suddenly illuminated our box seats, and there he was, down on one knee, with a ring that caught the theater lights like a small star. The entire audience turned to watch as I said, yes, tears streaming down my face. Even now, despite everything, I remember how perfect that moment felt. My mother cried harder than I did that night. She hugged him so tightly I had to laugh and pull her away, joking about how she was acting like she was the one getting engaged. She insisted we celebrate at her favorite restaurant downtown, the one with the intimate candlelit tables and wine list she'd memorized. She ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's rent, saying nothing was too good for her future son-in-law. The wedding planning consumed our lives for months. Every weekend meant appointments, dress fittings, cake tastings, venue tours, meetings with florists. My mother appointed herself as head coordinator, creating detailed spreadsheets and timelines that rivaled corporate project management systems. She had opinions about everything from the shade of white for my dress to the specific variety of roses for my bouquet. When I suggested having the ceremony at my father's church instead of the expensive cathedral she'd chosen, she practically had a panic attack. Sweetheart, the cathedral has such better acoustics for the music, and the architecture is so much more photogenic. This is your one special day. She had an answer for everything, always delivered with such conviction that I found myself agreeing just to keep the peace. My fiancé seemed oddly uninvolved for someone planning his own wedding. When I'd ask his opinion about table arrangements or menu choices, he'd shrug and say, "Whatever makes you and your mother happy." I thought he was being considerate, letting the women handle the traditionally feminine aspects of wedding planning. Now I realize he was letting my mother plan their fantasy wedding. Work became my refuge from the wedding chaos. At Morrison & Associates, I felt competent and valued. My boss frequently complimented my editorial instincts, and authors specifically requested me for their projects. I was building something that was entirely mine, separate from my identity as someone's daughter or future wife. But even at work, the wedding followed me. My mother would call daily with updates and questions. The florist needs to know if you prefer baby's breath or eucalyptus in the centerpieces. The caterer is asking about dietary restrictions for your fiancé's extended family. Always urgent, always needing immediate decisions. Looking back, I should have questioned why my mother knew so much about my fiancé's family's preferences, why she seemed to have his cousin's phone number memorized, why she always knew exactly which wine he preferred when we went out to dinner together. The first time I noticed something strange, I dismissed it as wedding stress affecting my judgment. It was a Thursday evening in early spring, about 2 months before the wedding. I'd stopped by my mother's house to drop off the final guest count for the caterer, and I found my fiancé's car parked in her driveway. When I walked into the kitchen, they were standing closer than seemed necessary, both holding glasses of wine and laughing at some private joke. My mother's cheeks were flushed, and she had that sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen since before my parents' marriage started deteriorating years ago. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, stepping back quickly from him. "We were just going over the seating chart. Your fiancé had such wonderful suggestions about where to place his business associates." He smiled that charming smile and kissed my cheek. "Your mother has incredible attention to detail. I was just telling her how lucky you are to have someone so invested in making your day perfect." They seemed to have an entire conversation with their eyes before my mother bustled over to the refrigerator. "Let me get you some wine, honey. We got this beautiful bottle from that vineyard upstate. Your fiancé picked it out. He said it's exactly what you'd love." The wine was perfect. It was from a small vineyard I'd mentioned loving during a weekend trip we'd taken 6 months earlier, but I'd never told my mother about that vineyard. I'd barely remembered mentioning it myself. "How did you know about that place?" I asked him. He exchanged another look with my mother before answering. "You mentioned it, remember last month when we were talking about honeymoon destinations?" I didn't remember that conversation, but wedding planning had become such a blur that I figured I must have forgotten. That was my first mistake, choosing to trust instead of questioning. The incidents became more frequent as the wedding approached. I'd call my mother and hear masculine laughter in the background before she'd quickly explain that my father was watching something funny on television. But my father was usually at the church during those times, preparing sermons or meeting with parishioners. One Saturday afternoon, I arrived at my mother's house unexpectedly to borrow her good serving dishes for a dinner party. I found her in the living room, disheveled in a way I'd never seen before. Her hair was messed, her lipstick was smudged, and she was wearing a silk robe at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Rebecca, I wasn't expecting you," she said, pulling the robe tighter around herself. "I called 20 minutes ago," I replied, confused. "You said to come over." "Did I?" "Oh, yes, of course, I was just taking a nap. Wedding planning is so exhausting." But the coffee table held 2 wine glasses, both recently used, and I could smell expensive cologne in the air, not my father's usual aftershave. One of the glasses had a lipstick mark that matched my mother's shade perfectly. The other had no trace of lipstick at all. "Were you expecting company?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No, sweetheart, just me here enjoying a quiet afternoon." She moved quickly to collect the glasses, but I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. I helped her gather the serving dishes, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire interaction. My mother was acting like someone hiding something, and I couldn't understand what she'd have to hide from me. 2 weeks later, I was having lunch with my fiancé at our favorite restaurant when his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. Not the polite smile he used with clients or acquaintances, but the intimate smile I thought was reserved for me. "Work?" I asked. "Just your mother confirming tomorrow's appointment with the wedding photographer," he said, putting the phone face down on the table. But I'd spoken to the photographer that morning and we'd moved the appointment to next week. When I mentioned this, he looked confused for a moment before recovering. "Oh, she must be talking about the backup photographer. You know how thorough she is about having contingency plans." We'd never discussed a backup photographer. 3 weeks before the wedding, I decided to surprise my mother with lunch. She'd been working so hard on wedding preparations, and I wanted to show my appreciation with her favorite takeout from the Greek place downtown. I used my key to let myself in, calling out as I entered, "Mom, I brought you lunch." No answer. I walked through the foyer toward the kitchen, but something felt different about the house. The air held a lingering scent of expensive cologne, and I noticed a men's suit jacket draped over the dining room chair. Not my father's style at all. It was charcoal gray, well-tailored, the kind my fiancé wore to important business meetings. I found my mother in the kitchen frantically tidying up. Her hair was disheveled, her blouse was wrinkled, and she had that flushed, breathless look of someone who'd been caught off guard. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" She seemed almost panicked. "I brought lunch," I said, slowly taking in the scene. 2 coffee cups sat in the sink, still warm. 2 plates with crumbs from what looked like an intimate brunch. A bottle of wine was open on the counter, half empty with 2 glasses nearby. "I thought you might be hungry." I continued, setting the takeout bag on the counter. "Were you expecting someone?" "No, sweetheart, just me here." Her voice was too bright, too quick. "I was just cleaning up from breakfast. You know how I hate leaving dishes around." But the table was set for 2 with her good china, the delicate porcelain set she only used for special occasions. A single red rose lay across one of the placemats, clearly fresh, its petals still perfect. The morning newspaper was folded open to the art section, something my mother never read, but my fiancé always checked for reviews of shows he wanted to see. "Mom, whose jacket is that in the dining room?" I asked directly. She followed my gaze and paused slightly. "Oh, that's your father's. He must have left it there this morning before church." But my father was conducting a wedding rehearsal across town at that exact moment. I knew because I'd helped him prepare the ceremony notes the night before, and the jacket was clearly too modern, too expensive for my father's conservative taste and modest pastor's salary. "I should probably get going," my mother said quickly, moving toward the jacket. "I have an appointment with the florist in an hour, and you know how traffic gets downtown." She was lying. We'd confirmed the florist appointment for tomorrow, not today. I'd written it in my planner myself. I stayed for 20 minutes, watching my mother act increasingly nervous. She kept glancing at the clock, jumping slightly whenever a car passed outside and making conversation that felt forced and unnatural. When I finally left, I noticed she immediately locked the door behind me, something she never did during the day. That evening, I mentioned the jacket to my father during dinner at their house. "Jacket," he said, genuinely confused. "What jacket?" "The charcoal gray one in the dining room this afternoon." I explained. "Mom said it was yours." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. My mother quickly stood to clear dishes that were still full of food. "Oh, that jacket," my father said carefully. "I borrowed it from someone at the church for the wedding photos next week. I wanted to look more contemporary, but my father had never cared about looking contemporary in his life, and he was at least 40 pounds heavier than whoever owned that perfectly tailored jacket." Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way my mother's face lit up whenever my fiancé called. How she always seemed to know his schedule better than I did. The fact that she'd started wearing different perfume, something more expensive and sensual than her usual light floral scent. When I mentioned to my fiancé that my mother seemed stressed about wedding preparations, he was quick to offer help. "Maybe I should stop by and help her with some of the vendor calls," he suggested. "I know she's been working so hard and I have more flexibility in my schedule this week." I thought it was sweet that he wanted to support my mother. I had no idea he was volunteering to spend more time alone with his lover. 1 week after finding the mysterious jacket, something shifted in my fiancé's behavior that I couldn't ignore. We'd been inseparable for 3 years, spending almost every evening together, sharing everything from work stress to silly inside jokes. Suddenly, he became distant and evasive in ways that felt completely foreign. It started on a Tuesday evening when I arrived at his apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. I had my key, as always, and let myself in calling his name. Usually, he'd greet me with enthusiasm, asking about my day and helping me set up dinner. Instead, I found him on the phone in his bedroom, with the door closed, speaking in hushed tones. When he finally emerged 20 minutes later, he seemed startled to see me. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "About 20 minutes. I brought dinner." I gestured toward the containers I'd arranged on his dining table. "Oh, I'm not really hungry tonight. I think I'm coming down with something." He did look flushed, but not in a sick way, more like someone who'd been caught in an uncomfortable situation. I moved closer to feel his forehead the way I had dozens of times during our relationship when he wasn't feeling well. He stepped back before I could touch him. "I don't want to get you sick," he said quickly. "Maybe you should go home tonight." In 3 years together, he'd never asked me to leave when he was feeling unwell. Usually, he wanted me to stay and take care of him. I offered to make tea or run to the pharmacy for medicine, but he insisted he just needed to sleep. As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed a wine glass on his kitchen counter with lipstick marks around the rim. The color was a deep burgundy shade that I'd never worn. I preferred lighter, more natural tones. When I asked about it, he glanced over and shrugged. "Must be from the cleaning lady. She was here earlier today, but his cleaning lady was a 60-year-old woman who wore no makeup and definitely wouldn't be drinking wine during her work hours." The next evening, I tried calling him around 7, our usual check-in time. The call went straight to voicemail. When I tried again an hour later, he answered, but sounded distracted and breathless. "Hey, sorry I missed your call earlier. I was at the gym and left my phone in the locker." "Which gym?" I asked casually. "I thought your usual place closed at 6 o'clock on Wednesdays." There was a pause before he answered. "I tried that new place downtown, the one with the later hours." I knew the gym he was referring to. It had closed permanently 3 months ago. I'd read about it in the local business journal at work. Friday afternoon, I decided to surprise him at his office with coffee and pastries from the bakery near my work. His assistant told me he'd left early for a personal appointment and wouldn't be back that day. When I called his cell phone, he answered after several rings. "Where are you?" I asked. "I stopped by your office." "Oh, I had to run an errand for my mother. Family stuff, you know how it is." But his mother lived in Florida and rarely required errands that couldn't be handled over the phone. When I suggested we meet for an early dinner since he was already out, he declined. "I'm pretty far uptown right now." Rain check. That evening, I drove past his apartment and saw his car in the parking garage. Whatever errand he'd been running hadn't taken him far uptown at all. The most unsettling incident happened 3 days later. I went to his apartment Saturday morning with fresh bagels and the newspaper, planning to spend a lazy morning together. Using my key, I found the apartment unusually quiet. I called his name but got no response. His bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. I knocked softly and heard movement inside, but he didn't answer immediately. When he finally opened the door, he was wearing only a towel and blocking my view into the room. "I was just getting out of the shower," he said, not making eye contact. "Can I come in?" "I brought breakfast. Actually, I'm feeling pretty sick again today. Maybe you should give me some space to recover." For the first time in our relationship, he didn't invite me into his own bedroom. When I tried to step around him to set my purse on his dresser, like I had hundreds of times before, he physically blocked my path. "I really think I'm contagious," he insisted. "I don't want you to catch whatever this is." As I left his apartment that morning, confused and hurt, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about his behavior made sense. The man I'd been planning to marry was treating me like a stranger, and I had no idea why. 2 days before the wedding, I went to my mother's house to collect some documents my father needed for the ceremony. The marriage license, the rings we'd stored in her safe, and the special Bible that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was supposed to be a quick trip, grab the items, and head back to the church for the final rehearsal. My mother wasn't home, but I had a key and knew exactly where everything was stored. The documents were in her bedroom safe, hidden behind a painting that had hung in the same spot since my childhood. As I knelt to open the safe, I noticed something on her nightstand that made me pause. It was a small leather journal I'd never seen before, placed carelessly next to her reading glasses and water glass. The cover was expensive looking, the kind of journal someone gives as a romantic gift, rather than something you'd buy for yourself at a drugstore. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that even as my hands moved toward it, even as I told myself I was just curious about my mother's new interest in journaling. The first page was dated 3 months ago, exactly when the strange incidents with my fiancé had begun. March 15th. He brought me flowers today. White tulips, my favorite, though I never told him that. Somehow he just knew. We talked for hours about literature, about life, about dreams we've never shared with anyone else. I feel like I'm waking up after years of sleepwalking. My blood ran cold as I read those words in my mother's careful handwriting. The flowers, the intimate conversation, the timing, it all pointed to something I couldn't bring myself to believe. I flipped to the next entry, March 22nd. The guilt is eating me alive, but I can't stop thinking about him. When he kissed me today, I felt more alive than I have in 20 years of marriage. We both know this is wrong, but neither of us seems able to stop. He says he's never felt this way about anyone, that what he has with Rebecca is comfortable, but not passionate. I should tell him to stay away, but I'm too selfish. I want to feel wanted again. The journal fell from my hands onto the carpet as the full horror of what I was reading sank in. My mother was having an affair with my fiancé. The man I was supposed to marry in 2 days had been sleeping with my mother for months. With trembling hands, I picked up the journal and continued reading each entry, more devastating than the last. April 5th, we made love in my bed today, while Rebecca was at work and her father was at the church. Afterward, he held me and said he wished things were different, that he wished he'd met me first. I know I should feel ashamed, but lying in his arms felt like the most natural thing in the world. April 18th, Rebecca showed me her final dress-fitting photos today. She looked so beautiful, so happy, so trusting. I wanted to tell her the truth, but how can I destroy her life for my own happiness? He says we can continue after the wedding, that marriages of convenience are common in his social circle. I hate myself for even considering it. May 10th, we've started planning how to maintain our relationship after the wedding. He'll have legitimate reasons to visit often. Family dinners, holidays, helping with home repairs. Rebecca will never suspect because she trusts us both completely. Sometimes I think she's too trusting for her own good. Entry after entry detailed their affair with clinical precision. The locations where they met, the lies they told me, the future they were planning, while I prepared to marry him in complete ignorance. My mother wrote about their intimate moments with a passion I'd never heard her express about my father. About their plans to continue deceiving me indefinitely, about how my trusting nature made their betrayal easier to execute. The final entry was dated yesterday, June 20th. Tomorrow is the wedding. He came over this morning for what we agreed would be our last time together before the ceremony. We both cried afterward, holding each other like teenagers saying goodbye before college. He promised that after a respectable honeymoon period, we'd find a way to be together again. I feel like I'm attending my daughter's funeral instead of her wedding. But I can't give him up. I won't give him up. I sat on my mother's bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal I could imagine. Not only was my fiancé cheating on me, but he was doing it with my own mother. Not only was my mother betraying her marriage, but she was betraying her daughter in the cruelest way possible. They had planned this deception together, calculated exactly how to continue their affair after my wedding, and documented their betrayal in my mother's own handwriting. The man I loved and the woman who gave me life had conspired to make me the unknowing third party in their love triangle. I left my mother's house with the journal clutched in my hands and drove straight to the Marriott downtown, where I checked into a room under my maiden name. I couldn't go home to my apartment. Too many memories of planning our future together. I couldn't go to my father's. Not until I decided what to tell him. I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out how to respond to the most devastating betrayal of my life. Sitting on the hotel bed, I read through the journal 3 more times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood anything. But there was no ambiguity in my mother's words. She detailed their affair with the precision of someone keeping a record for posterity. Dates, locations, conversations, intimate moments. Everything was documented with cruel clarity. My first instinct was to call them both, to scream, to demand explanations. But as I sat in that anonymous hotel room, something shifted inside me. The shock began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. They had planned this betrayal, methodically documenting their deception, plotting how to continue fooling me after my wedding. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated campaign of deceit. They deserved a calculated response. I spent the entire night planning. I made lists, analyzed evidence, and considered every possible outcome. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. First, I called my office and took a personal day. Then I went to a print shop and made copies of the most damning journal pages, the ones that explicitly detailed their affair and their plans to continue it after my marriage. I sealed the copies in an envelope and stored them in the hotel safe as backup evidence. Next, I called the photographer and made a special request. I told him I wanted to surprise the guests with a slideshow during the reception, personal photos and messages from people who couldn't attend. He was delighted with the idea and agreed to set up the projection system. I spent hours creating that slideshow. Along with genuine family photos and sweet messages from distant relatives, I embedded photographs of my mother's journal pages. Not enough to overwhelm the presentation, but enough to ensure that every single person at my wedding would understand exactly what kind of people they were celebrating. Then I called my father, not to tell him about the affair. That conversation needed to happen in person, but to ask him to meet me at the hotel that evening. I told him I needed to discuss something important about the ceremony. When my father arrived, I showed him the journal. I watched his face transform from confusion to disbelief to devastation as he read his wife's detailed account of her betrayal. He aged 10 years and 10 minutes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he was learning. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since yesterday afternoon. I found it when I went to get the marriage documents." We sat in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "What do you want to do?" "I want to expose them publicly in front of everyone who thinks they're good, moral people." My father, who had preached about forgiveness and turning the other cheek for 30 years, nodded slowly. "They made their choices," he said. "They can live with the consequences." We spent the rest of the evening planning exactly how the revelation would unfold. My father would perform the ceremony normally until we reached the vows. Then, instead of exchanging traditional promises, I would address the congregation directly. "Are you sure about this?" my father asked as he prepared to leave. "Once you do this, there's no going back. They made that choice for me when they decided to betray everything we're supposed to mean to each other," I replied. "I'm just refusing to be a victim of their lies." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time since finding the journal, I felt like I had some control over my own life. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of 200 people and tell the truth. Not their carefully crafted version of reality, but the actual truth. I wasn't going to quietly disappear or privately confront them in some tearful family meeting. They had chosen to make their betrayal elaborate and public by planning to continue it throughout my marriage. They deserved an equally public response. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 6 with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. No pre-wedding jitters, no butterflies, no last-minute doubts about my dress or hair. Just a calm, focused determination to see my plan through to completion. I ordered room service, fresh fruit yogurt, and coffee, and ate slowly while reviewing my speech one final time. I'd written it the night before, timing it to last exactly 3 minutes, long enough to deliver all the essential facts, short enough to finish before anyone could stop me. At 9 o'clock, my bridesmaids arrived at the hotel for the getting ready portion of the day. 3 women I'd known since college, all excited to be part of what they thought was the happiest day of my life. I smiled and laughed with them as they helped me into my dress, applied my makeup, and arranged my hair in the elaborate updo my mother had insisted upon. "You look absolutely radiant," said my maid of honor, fastening my grandmother's pearl necklace around my throat. "I've never seen you so calm before a big event." She was right. I felt completely at peace with what was about to happen. The wedding photographer arrived at 10 to capture the pre-ceremony moments. I posed for the traditional shots, putting on my shoes, holding my bouquet, looking pensively out the window. All the images that were supposed to document a bride's anticipation and joy. Instead, they were documenting my preparation for war. At 11:30, my father arrived to escort me to the cathedral. The moment he saw me in my full wedding regalia, his composure cracked slightly. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, taking my hands in his. "We can call it off right now. Tell everyone you're sick or that you've changed your mind. No one would blame you. I need to do this," I replied, straightening his tie with steady hands. "They planned their betrayal. I get to plan my response." He nodded, understanding that this was about more than just ending a relationship. This was about reclaiming my dignity and refusing to be the naive victim in someone else's story. In the limousine on the way to the cathedral, I tucked the copied journal pages into my bouquet, securing them between the roses with ribbon. My something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and something true. The cathedral looked exactly as my mother had envisioned. White lies everywhere, candles flickering along the aisle, soft classical music filling the soaring space. 200 guests filled the pews, dressed in their finest clothes, chattering excitedly about the beautiful ceremony they were about to witness. I stood in the vestibule, watching through the partially open doors as my mother took her seat in the front row. She was wearing the navy blue dress we'd chosen together, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as if she were genuinely moved by the occasion. The performance was flawless, the picture of a proud mother on her daughter's wedding day. My fiancé stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks nervously as he waited for me to appear. From this distance, he looked like every woman's dream groom, handsome, successful, from a good family. The congregation probably thought he was nervous about the magnitude of the commitment he was making. They had no idea he'd already made his real commitment to someone else. 5 minutes, whispered the wedding coordinator. an efficient woman in a black suit who'd managed dozens of ceremonies in this cathedral. Are you ready? I looked at myself in the full-length mirror one last time. The woman staring back at me looked beautiful, composed, ready for anything. My dress was perfect, my makeup flawless, my hair arranged exactly as planned. I looked like a bride who is about to have the wedding of her dreams. Instead, I was about to give 200 people a story they'd never forget. I'm ready, I told the coordinator. My father appeared beside me, offering his arm. His face was grave but determined. He'd spent the morning preparing himself for what was about to happen, and I could see he was ready to support me completely. Last chance to change your mind, he murmured as the music shifted to signal the processional was about to begin. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I replied. The doors opened fully and I saw the entire congregation turn to look at me. 200 faces filled with anticipation and joy, ready to celebrate what they thought was a beautiful love story. In the front row, my mother pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, playing her role perfectly. At the altar, my fiancé smiled, that charming smile that had once made me believe in fairy tales. I took my first step down the aisle, my father's steady presence beside me. With each step, I could feel the weight of the journal pages hidden in my bouquet, the evidence that would shatter the illusion everyone was living in, including myself until yesterday. The wedding march played and guests smiled and waved as I passed. Some wiped away tears, thinking they were witnessing a beautiful moment. Others took photos wanting to capture what they believed was pure joy. They were about to witness something entirely different, not a wedding but a reckoning, not a celebration of love but an exposure of betrayal, not the beginning of a marriage but the end of lies. As I approached the altar, I caught my fiancé's eye. He was looking at me with what appeared to be genuine affection, as if he'd somehow convinced himself that marrying me while planning to continue his affair with my mother was an act of love rather than cruelty. In 30 seconds, his carefully constructed world was going to collapse. I reached the altar and took my place beside my fiancé, who leaned over to whisper, "You look absolutely beautiful." His voice carried genuine warmth, as if he'd completely compartmentalized his betrayal from this moment. My father began the ceremony with his usual grace and dignity. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls in holy matrimony." His voice was steady, giving no indication of what was about to unfold. The congregation settled into their seats, smiling and attentive. I could see my mother in the front row beaming with what appeared to be maternal pride. My fiancé's family filled the opposite side, looking pleased with their son's choice of bride. Everyone was playing their assigned roles perfectly. My father continued through the opening prayers and readings, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the pulpit. When we reached the section about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of honesty between spouses, I saw him glance at me almost imperceptibly. It was time. Now my father said, his voice taking on a more solemn tone. "Before we proceed with the vows, Rebecca has something she would like to share with all of you." A murmur of surprise rippled through the congregation. This wasn't part of the traditional ceremony format, and guests began to sit up straighter, curious about what was coming. I turned to face the assembled crowd, my bouquet steady in my hands. 200 faces looked back at me expectantly, thinking they were about to hear a romantic personal message, or perhaps a tribute to deceased grandparents. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics. "I know many of you traveled long distances to celebrate what you believed would be the happiest day of my life." I paused, letting that past tense sink in. A few people exchanged glances, sensing something was different about my tone. Unfortunately, I discovered something 2 days ago that changes everything. I reached into my bouquet and withdrew the journal pages, unfolding them carefully. My mother has been keeping a detailed record of her 3-month affair with my fiancé. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a cough, not a rustle of clothing, not even the sound of breathing. 200 people sat frozen in their seats, processing what they'd just heard. My fiancé's face went white, then red, then white again. "Rebecca, what are you doing?" he whispered urgently. I ignored him and continued reading directly from my mother's journal. "March, he brought me flowers today. White tulips, my favorite, though I never told him that. We talked for hours about literature, about life, about dreams we've never shared with anyone else." My mother half rose from her seat, her face a mask of horror. "Rebecca, stop this immediately." April 5th. I continued reading, my voice growing stronger with each word. "We made love in my bed today while Rebecca was at work and her father was at the church. Afterward, he held me and said he wished things were different, that he wished he'd met me first." Gasps erupted throughout the cathedral. People began turning to stare at my mother and my fiancé, their faces showing shock, disgust, and fascination in equal measure. My fiancé grabbed my arm. "You're making a mistake. Let me explain." I pulled away from him and read the final entry. June 20th. Tomorrow is the wedding. We both cried afterward, holding each other like teenagers. He promised that after a respectable honeymoon period, we'd find a way to be together again. I feel like I'm attending my daughter's funeral instead of her wedding. The cathedral erupted in chaos. People were standing shouting, pulling out their phones to record what was happening. My fiancé's mother screamed, "This is impossible!" My mother's friends stared at her in horror as she collapsed back into the pew sobbing. They planned to continue their affair throughout my marriage, I announced over the noise. This journal documents their betrayal in my mother's own handwriting. Every lie they told me, every deception they planned, every moment they chose their selfish desires over my well-being. I set the journal pages on the altar and faced my fiancé directly. Did you really think I was too stupid to figure it out eventually? Too trusting to notice the signs, too weak to do anything about it? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man watching his entire life implode in real time. I turned back to the congregation one final time. The chaos had settled into a horrified silence as people waited to see what I would do next. I want everyone here to understand something, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. I could have handled this privately. I could have quietly called off the wedding. Let them save face, protected their reputations, but they chose to document their betrayal. They chose to plan a future of continued deception. They chose to make me an unknowing participant in their sick game. I walked down the altar steps, my wedding dress trailing behind me like a queen's train. So I chose to respond publicly. Everyone who thought they were celebrating a beautiful love story deserves to know they were actually enabling a cruel deception. My mother finally found her voice. "Rebecca, please. I can explain everything. You don't understand. I understand perfectly," I cut her off. "I understand that you betrayed your daughter, your marriage, and every value you claim to represent. I understand that he betrayed our relationship, his promises to me, and the trust of everyone who believed in him. Most importantly, I understand that I deserve better than both of you." I turned to my father, who had watched the entire scene unfold with quiet dignity. "Thank you for supporting me today. It means everything." He nodded, his eyes filled with pride and sadness in equal measure. I began walking back down the aisle, my head held high as I passed 200 stunned guests. Some tried to reach out to me with words of support. Others sat in shocked silence, but most were already pulling out their phones to share what they just witnessed. My fiancé's voice called out behind me. "Rebecca, wait. We can work this out. I made a mistake, but I love you. I didn't turn around or break my stride." "You don't love me," I called back without looking. "You love the idea of having us both, but that was never your choice to make." As I reached the back of the cathedral, I could hear the explosion of voices behind me. Arguments, accusations, shocked conversations, the sound of people choosing sides in real time. My mother's sobs echoed off the stone walls. My fiancé was apparently trying to explain himself to his family, whose voices rose in anger and disgust. Outside the cathedral, the afternoon sun was brilliant and warm. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the fresh air and feeling lighter than I had in months. Behind me, the chaos continued as guests streamed out of the building, some trying to offer support, others clearly just eager to spread the gossip. My best friend from college reached me first. "Rebecca." "Oh my God, are you okay? Where are you going to go?" "I'm going to be fine," I told her, meaning it completely. I'm going to be better than fine. Within hours, the story had spread across social media. Videos of the ceremony reveal were shared thousands of times. My mother's carefully cultivated reputation as a devoted pastor's wife crumbled overnight. My fiancé's law firm began receiving calls asking about his character and judgment. Their betrayal, which they'd thought was a secret affair, became a public scandal that followed them everywhere. The wedding that was supposed to be the beginning of my perfect life, instead, became the moment I chose to value myself over everyone else's comfort. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be a victim of other people's selfishness. And for the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to please people who didn't deserve my devotion. 6 months later, I was living in a sunny apartment in Portland, Oregon, 2,000 meters away from the wreckage of my former life. I'd taken a senior editor position at a small but prestigious publishing house that specialized in contemporary women's fiction stories about resilience, transformation, and finding strength in unexpected places. My new life was simple but deeply satisfying. I worked with authors who wrote about complicated heroines making difficult choices. I lived alone for the first time since college and discovered I genuinely enjoyed my own company. My apartment had large windows, hardwood floors, and bookshelves from floor to ceiling. I'd furnished it entirely according to my own taste. No input from well-meaning family members or partners who thought they knew better than I did what would make me happy. The first 3 months had been challenging. The story of my wedding revelation had followed me online, making dating feel impossible and job interviews awkward. But eventually, people stopped recognizing me as that woman from the wedding video, and I could build a reputation based on my work rather than my personal drama. My father had visited twice, both times looking healthier and more at peace than I'd seen him in years. He'd filed for divorce from my mother a week after the wedding, citing irreconcilable differences and betrayal of marital vows. The divorce was finalized 4 months later, and he'd since started seeing a kind widow from his congregation, someone who appreciated his integrity rather than exploiting it. "I should thank you," he told me during his second visit as we sat in my favorite coffee shop overlooking the river. "You gave me permission to admit that my marriage had been making me miserable for years. I was so focused on the idea that good Christians work through everything that I never asked myself whether I deserved to be happy." I'd received exactly 3 communication attempts from my mother in 6 months. The first was a 10-page letter delivered 2 weeks after the wedding, filled with justifications, excuses, and requests for forgiveness that felt more about her guilt than my healing. I read it once and threw it away. The second was a voicemail on my birthday, crying and begging me to call her back so she could explain everything properly. I deleted it without listening to the entire message. The third was a package containing family photos and jewelry she thought I might want, along with a note saying she understood why I was angry, but hoped someday I could forgive her. I donated the jewelry to charity and kept one photo, a picture of me and my father at my college graduation, both of us beaming with genuine joy. It was the only family photo where my mother wasn't present, and therefore the only one that didn't make me feel sick to look at. My former fiancé had attempted contact more frequently and more desperately. He'd tried calling, texting, showing up at my old apartment, and even having mutual friends reach out on his behalf. All of his messages followed the same pattern: initial apologies followed by explanations about how the affair just happened, then anger when I didn't respond, then bargaining about how we could work through this together. His final message, sent 4 months after the wedding, was a rambling email about how he'd realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life and was willing to do anything to win me back. He claimed he'd ended things with my mother immediately after the wedding and was in therapy to understand why he'd betrayed me so completely. I read the entire message, then blocked his email address without responding. He didn't deserve my forgiveness, my anger, or my attention. He deserved to be forgotten. The most surprising part of my new life was how little I missed either of them. I'd expected to feel sad, lonely, or angry most of the time. Instead, I felt relieved. The constant low-level anxiety I'd carried throughout my engagement, always wondering if I was good enough, smart enough, interesting enough, had disappeared completely. I no longer had to perform the role of the perfect daughter or the ideal fiancé. I could just be Rebecca, figuring out what I wanted without anyone else's input or approval. 1 year after my wedding that never was, I stood in front of 300 women at the Portland Convention Center, delivering a keynote speech titled "Choosing Truth Over Comfort: Why Self-Respect is Never Selfish." The speaking engagement had come about unexpectedly. A women's leadership organization had contacted me after reading an essay I'd published in a national magazine about recognizing betrayal and refusing to be a victim. They wanted someone to talk about making difficult choices in the face of personal crisis. A year ago, I thought my life was perfect. I told the audience, my voice steady and confident. I had a successful career, a beautiful wedding planned, and what I believed was a loving family supporting me. I also had a fiancé who was having an affair with my mother, but I was too trusting to see it. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. When I discovered their betrayal 2 days before my wedding, I had a choice. I could handle it privately, quietly, in a way that protected their reputations and maintained family peace. Or I could choose honesty, messy, painful public honesty that would expose the truth and force everyone to confront reality. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, women of all ages who had faced their own moments of crisis and decision. I chose truth, and it was the most liberating choice I've ever made. I spent the next 45 minutes sharing what I'd learned about self-respect, about the difference between kindness and enabling, about the courage it takes to disappoint people who don't have your best interest at heart. The response was overwhelming. A standing ovation followed by a line of women wanting to share their own stories of choosing difficult truths over comfortable lies. After the event, I drove home to my apartment where I'd built a life that was entirely my own. No compromises, no committee decisions, no trying to be the person others wanted me to be. I had plants I'd chosen because I liked them, books arranged according to my own system, food in my refrigerator that reflected my actual tastes rather than someone else's preferences. I'd started dating again 3 months ago, carefully, selectively, with clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't accept. The man I was seeing was a literature professor at Portland State University who appreciated my independence and had never once suggested I was too intense or too demanding for knowing my worth. My career was thriving in ways it never had when I was planning my life around someone else's schedule and priorities. I'd been promoted twice and was considering starting my own literary consulting business. I'd also begun writing a book about my experience, not a memoir of victimhood, but a practical guide for women who found themselves in similar situations. My relationship with my father had never been stronger. He'd remarried 6 months ago to the widow from his congregation, and their happiness was a joy to witness. He'd called me the morning after his wedding to tell me how proud he was of the courage I'd shown, how my choice to stand up for myself had given him permission to do the same. As for my mother and former fiancé, I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Their affair had lasted exactly 3 weeks after my wedding revelation. Apparently, reality was less appealing than fantasy. My mother had moved to Florida to live near her sister, unable to face the social consequences of her actions in our hometown. My former fiancé had left his law firm and moved to Chicago, supposedly to start fresh, but more likely to escape the reputation he'd earned. Neither of them had succeeded in rebuilding the lives they'd destroyed in pursuit of their selfish desires. The affair that had seemed worth risking everything for had evaporated under public scrutiny, leaving them both alone with the consequences of their choices. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy about their outcomes. They had become irrelevant to my story the moment I chose to value myself over their comfort. Sitting in my apartment that evening, surrounded by books I loved and plans I'd made independently, I realized that my revenge had never been about destroying them. It had been about refusing to be destroyed by them. My revenge was this life, free, authentic, and entirely my own. My revenge was discovering that I was stronger, more interesting, and more capable than I'd ever known when I was trying to be perfect for people who didn't deserve my perfection. The woman who had stood at that altar a year ago, devastated and betrayed, had been transformed into someone who would never again accept less than she deserved. And that transformation was worth more than any marriage built on lies could have ever.